It's the AEMT lecture series. This will be video number 1 for chapter 11, Airway. So welcome back, everybody. Lots to talk about in the airway for sure. We're glad to have y'all settle in, get a cup of coffee. Probably going to be a somewhat of a long video. Probably going to at least go 45 minutes and probably more than one video. And that's because airway is complex. It's important. And it's something that we need to clearly understand, because if we don't have an airway, we don't maintain an airway properly, then we're going to have people that are going to die that shouldn't die. So that's what we're talking about. Okay, so we know about this slide right here because we're kind of coming out of anatomy and physiology, and it's kind of a good review for us. We understand, I believe, that how the alveoli work. We understand that the respiratory system and the circulatory system work hand in hand, and one relies on the other. We need to understand, this is a chapter that we need to understand the terminology. We need to understand the differences in, ventilation, what that means, respiration, what that means, etc. All right, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to review the anatomy and the physiology of the airway briefly. The respiratory system, it's consisted of the structures, in the body that makes us breathe better, right? The airway is divided into the upper and lower airways. Okay. Let's see here. Flip to the next slide here. We know that we have the diaphragm, right? And large muscle here. We know that the diaphragm receives its kind of commands from the respiratory center of the brain. We know that it's responsible for about 70% of breathing. We have the muscles of the chest wall. Excuse me. So we have the intercostal muscles. Then we have the accessory muscles. Okay. We know that the larynx is the dividing point between the upper and lower airway. Hang on 1 second. We'll go back to that next slide. All right, so we need to understand what the function of the upper airway is, right? Because every system kind of has a function, and that function of the upper airway is to warm and humidify air. Okay, so we know when we're talking about the upper airway, we're talking about from the larynx superior, meaning larynx and above. We know that when we're talking about the pharynx here, it's composed of 3 parts, right? We have the pharynx, right? We have the nasopharynx, we have the oral pharynx, and we have the hypopharynx. We know, let's see here. So here's your, and we know pharynx just kind of means throat. With the nasopharynx, that's the part here that comes to the back of the throat here. The oral pharynx coming to the back of the throat here, and then the hypopharynx. It's just above the trachea, right around the right at the glottic opening. And here we can see that we have the epiglottis here, right? Okay, nasopharynx, your oropharynx, your laryngopharynx. Yeah, so. Okay. Oh, that's very important because you could get questions on here that could say, wanting to know something about the anatomy. They may say that, we flip back up here. The epiglottis is, inferior or superior to the larynx. Yeah, well, it's superior. It's above the larynx. That sort of thing. That's the kind of things you need to understand, about the anatomy. Okay. So we'll briefly talk about the nasopharynx. Don't get a whole lot of airway emergencies in this area. Not to say that we might have some airway management issues coming from like a nose that's bleeding, and the blood going to the back of the nasopharynx coming down. But even then, normally not too big of a problem to manage. It's when it gets into the oropharynx is where we have problems. Talking about the oropharynx, here we go. Part of the throat that's found at the posterior, the back of the oral cavity. We have the epiglottis, the leaf-shaped flap, right, that's there to hopefully keep food and stuff from getting into the trachea. You'll notice it says the epiglottis here is above the larynx. Okay, that's good to know because if you were asked a question about that, there it is. That's how you want to study. When you're looking at PowerPoints, when you're trying to study, and you have so much to study. Well, make test questions in your head as you're studying. It'll help you. Talks about the epiglottis, what it's there for. But it says also combined with the closure of the vocal cords. So they protect the airway from aspiration from eating and drinking. So there's talks about that. That's important to understand. The epiglottis, what it does, those vocal cords can spasm. So they close and open if they feel like something's trying to get into the trachea that is foreign. And then we have the larynx, with its cartilage in the rings. Okay, it helps to keep the trachea just below it open. So that's something good to know. Your larynx is just superior. Well, just superior. Going there. Hang on a second. Let me go back to that slide. The larynx is just superior to the trachea. There's your thyroid cartilage. Talks about the glottic opening. It's the narrowest portion of the adult trachea. So that's probably where you're going to end up having your upper airway type events happening, because it's the most narrowest portion of the adult trachea. Lower airway, and we should understand by now that the main function of the lower airway is gas exchange. Okay, the trachea is the conduit for air from the external from the environment. We take a deep breath in. It takes that air down through the bronchioles to the alveoli. So here's your trachea. This is the carina. This is where the bronchioles branch off to right and left. You have your alveoli at the end of the bronchioles. And then you have bronchi, then they call it smaller bronchi, and then just like I mentioned, bronchioles. We're talking about the visceral plural and how it works. The visceral plural is it actually touches the lungs. Okay, it covers the lungs. It keeps the lungs kind of moist or a little bit wet, and then just if you can just above that or attached to that is the parietal plural, and it attaches to the chest wall. And so then you would have in the middle would be something called a potential space, also called the pleural itself. Now, if you were to open the chest up and look, you would not see this at all, because it's you would only see it if there was, air there or something in the middle that would separate it, because it's such a tiny space. So hang on one second. That was pretty ugly. I need a new pen or something that works better than what I have. All right, slide this over here. Okay, my best effort here to draw along with this pen. Okay. So, if you take a look at this, there's your lung right here, right? And so this would be the part that attaches to the lung. We'll call it your visceral plural. Okay. Now, get a different color here so we can kind of line this up for you. And one more thing real quick. Again, I'm so sorry for the drawing. Okay. The part of the pleural that attaches to the chest wall here is your parietal plural. And just to save space here, I'm just going to abbreviate. I'll use PP. All right. So this part attaches to the chest wall. And now what you'll notice here in the middle, this is what I'm talking about right here in the middle. That's your actual pleural cavity, or let me say that again, pleural space. Okay. And it actually has a little bit of fluid in here that helps, with friction and stuff like that. But this is the chest wall, so imagine it expanding out when you take a deep breath. And so what does that do? Well, it's going to actually help these lungs to expand. And so because the parietal pleural will actually pull on that visceral pleural so that the lung will expand out. Okay. So that's kind of how that works. And we'll talk about the bronchus. We really don't need to talk about the bronchus. I think you all understand that. The alveoli, you understand that. The only thing I do want to mention about the bronchioles, just to remind you, that they're made up of smooth muscle, right? And that's important because if you're having bronchial constriction, we can introduce medication to cause bronchial dilation, and we can get that because of the bronchioles having smooth muscle. Okay. Surfactant. So what we're talking about now is the alveoli itself. And if you're looking at the alveoli, and it's very important that these alveoli stay inflated. They don't need to lose their structure. So in order for that to happen, though, they need something called surfactant. And surfactant allows the alveoli to stay inflated, and because it increases surface area, and it's important for gas exchange. Okay, and so between the lungs is the mediastinum. It's surrounded by what they call tough connected tissue. Okay, and then we have the pharynx nerve, and you can see right here where my cursor is. The pharynx nerve comes down, and it actually attaches to the diaphragm, and that's why the diaphragm can receive messages from the central and peripheral nervous systems to actually just from the central nervous system in order to expand or to take shorter breaths. So we know that the respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together, right? Because in order to be able to breathe, we have to be able to breathe oxygen, but that gas exchange has to happen. Cardiovascular wise, that's what transports the blood that's going to come through the alveoli to make that gas exchange happen. So they work hand in hand. Let's see here. Just remember, arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Okay. And all veins, except for one, carry deoxygenated blood. All veins, except for one, carry deoxygenated blood. Which vein does not carry deoxygenated blood? And that would be your pulmonary vein, because it's returning from the lungs with oxygenated blood. It's returning from the lungs back to the heart over to your left atrium, right? So even though it's returning to the heart, which veins do, this one actually carries that oxygenated blood. Everything the cell needs a constant supply of oxygen. I'm sorry, every cell does. We know this, right? But it's time critical. And this is some times here that are important to understand. 0 to 1 minute of poor gas exchange, or it could lead to cardiac irritability. That cardiac irritability can cause cardiac um, irregular rhythms, right? Now, I want you to think about this because this is more than likely times based on a average person without a extensive medical history. So these times could be even more critical for a patient who has some type of medical problems. All right, so we're going to continue to talk about ventilation now. And what is ventilation? Well, ventilation is the process of moving air into and out of the lungs. Okay? So get that definition. Okay? Because you'll see these again. Ventilation is the process of moving air into and out of the lungs. It's necessary for oxygenation and respiration. Okay, those are going to be two different things, right? But ventilation is necessary to allow for oxygenation and respiration. We already know it's essential for life. And we know that if you had a patient who wasn't adequately breathing, right, that we would have to have some type of immediate intervention in order to ensure adequate ventilation. Then we have inhalation, right? And so that's an active muscular part of breathing. It's an active muscular part of breathing. Air is going to enter the body through the mouth and the nose, and it moves to where? Moves down through the pharynx, down into ultimately into the trachea. We have to understand that we have the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. They're going to have to contract, but I want you to think about it for a second, because the lungs are not muscular. Okay? They are totally dependent upon the diaphragm and those intercostal muscles to contract. If something's wrong, if the diaphragm's injured, if the intercostal muscles are injured, then you're gonna have a problem, right? So diaphragm, intercostal muscles, they must contract, allowing the lungs to fill with air. So the ability for the lungs to function properly, and in order for them, I guess that's right, to function properly is a good thing to say. They're dependent upon the thorax, okay, the thorax cage or rib cage, the diaphragm, and those accessory muscles. All right, very dependent. Very dependent. All right, let me catch up with some notes here real quick. I want to make sure I'm covering everything I'm supposed to. All right, the diaphragm, I think I said it's specialized skeletal muscle innervated by the phrenic nerve. And then it's when we talk about this, breathing is it's voluntary and involuntary, right? So we're going to be using voluntary muscles and involuntary muscle, because when you take a deep breath, or you cough, or you hold your breath, right? Well, that's voluntary. But at tonight, when you go to sleep, that's not going to be voluntary at all. That'll be involuntary. So it uses both systems. So partial pressures and amount of gas, we'll talk about that. Partial pressure describes the amount of gas in the air or dissolved in fluid. All right. So it describes the amount of gas. That's all it does, partial pressure. It's descriptive for how much of a certain gas, CO2, O2, right, is in the blood. It's usually measured in millimeters of mercury, and the body is attempting to equalize this partial pressure, which results in diffusion. Oxygen diffusing across the membrane, right? And then you have something called atmospheric pressure, right? So that's the amount of pressure found in the atmosphere. And it's normally higher than the pressure within the thorax. So when you're breathing, there's a small but very effective vacuum that's created. Okay, so usually gases like oxygen, they're going to move from that higher pressure to an area of lower pressure until those pressures are both pressures are equalized, and that's pretty much the same definition as diffusion, right? It's just how it happens, really. And then that entire process of inspiration, right? And the entire process of inspiration is focused on delivering oxygen to those alveoli. So if you are looking in your book and you look at table 11.2, you need to understand what's going on here. Okay, so let's talk about tidal volume. That's the amount of air, okay, in millimeters, but doesn't matter. It's the amount of air that's moved in and out of the lungs during one breath. Okay, so then there's something called residual volume, and that's just the amount of amount of air. My throat's kind of messed up. I'm sorry, guys. The amount of air that's going to remain in the lungs after your max expiration. Okay, after you breathe out all the air you can breathe out, it's what's going to be left. Then you have alveolar ventilation. Okay, and all that is, guys, is just the amount of air that the alveoli are going to receive. Okay, that's all that is. Then there's minute volume. So this is the volume of air that's moved through the lungs in 1 minute. Okay. And then I want you to look at the one dead space, the portion of the tidal volume that does not reach the alveoli and thus does not participate in gas exchange. Okay. So that's the amount of air that's going to be lost in between you inspiring that air coming into the oropharynx, right? Some of that's getting caught there. Some of it's going to get lost in the trachea. Some of it's going to get lost in the bronchioles, right? We're not when we inhale, we're going to inhale a certain amount of air, but it's not all going to get to the alveoli. So exhalation, right? Exhalation does not require muscular effort in the passive process. So let me explain this. All right. So in a normal, like someone, me and you right now, hope normal, right? So we're not using muscles or energy to exhale. That can change when we're in respiratory distress. Okay, but right now we're not. right now we're not. All right, so before I get too much further, let's talk about. We're talking about. I just want to back up so everybody's clear on the partial pressures and stuff. So atmospheric pressure, I said, is usually higher than the pressure inside the thorax. Inspiration focuses on delivery of O2 to the alveoli. And exhalation, I just said, is passive unless we're in distress, meaning that there's no energy cost there. All right. So when we're talking about PaO2, what we're talking about is that deoxygenated blood. All right, it's coming from the right side of the heart, has a certain partial pressure of oxygen, right? Now, that partial pressure on that side, if we're taking it from the venous side, and we're going to associate venous to the right side of the heart, we want to associate arterial from the left side of the heart, because deoxygenated blood is received to the right and oxygenated blood is delivered from the left. Okay, so obviously on that venous side, it's going to be a lower pressure of oxygen found, right? Because it's already dropped off its oxygen, so it's going to be a lower number, right? And the body attempts to, it wants to, when we're having diffusion, like I said earlier, the body's going to attempt to equalize that partial pressure, all right, which results in diffusion when it crosses the membrane. All right, back to this. Okay. All right, so the Herring-Brewix reflex, need to know that definition, right? So it terminates inhalation and it prevents the lungs from overexpanding. And it's part of a feedback loop. Okay, so it's a combination of mechanical and neural control. Mechanical being like the part that we can kind of control a bit, rib cage when we take a deep breath, right? But the brain has stuff there through the nervous system that won't allow us to pop our lung. Right. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about, and you've had all this in EMT school. I haven't got, this is just the same chapter. There's nothing new here. I'm just covering it, just kind of a helpful reminder of what's going on. Regulation of ventilation. The body's need for oxygen is always dynamic. For the most part, we know that the drive to breathe is based on pH changes, right? So in like us, when the oxygen level rises, the respiratory center suspends respirations until rising carbon dioxide levels stimulate the respiratory center, meaning we're monitoring in a normal healthy individual CO2 readings. because CO2 increases in CO2 is going to make us more acidotic, right? Less CO2 is going to make us alkalotic. And so basically that's what we monitor. Now there is something that called hypoxic drive. That's the opposite. That's for folks like COPD patients who retain lots of CO2 because of their disease. Well, those receptors grow weary of trying to read CO2, and they'll start reading O2, and that's something called a hypoxic drive. But we are a carbonic drive for normal individuals. Okay, and we know that hemoglobin, right, is what carries oxygen. It's found in the red blood cell, and hemoglobin and iron, right, because iron is what keeps the hemoglobin seated inside that red blood cell. Okay, and we know about metabolism, all right, and there's something called cellular respiration. Cells take energy from nutrients, and we already kind of talked about that chemical process. Let me check here. When we're talking about that, so basically what we're talking about here is in cellular respiration is the body provides through respiration an exchange of oxygen and CO2. All right. That's what is occurring. Then we have external respiration, right? When we talk about external respiration, we're talking about the process of breathing fresh air into the respiratory system. Then we're talking about exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. Right? Adequate ventilation doesn't always guarantee that external respiration is gonna work, right? Because again, the hemoglobin, right? It picks up fresh oxygen as it crosses the alveolar because it's those red blood cells again. Okay. And in internal respiration, this is basically, guys, systemic. This is talking about blood traveling from the left side of the heart out to the cells. Okay, and that's what we're talking about, and that's internal. Like, think about internal cells, internal things that are going, not pulmonary, but internal. That's what internal respiration is. It's internally providing that oxygenated blood to those cells all throughout the body who needs it, and then they're picking up that CO2 and bringing it back to the right side of the heart so that pulmonary ventilation can occur. We know what aerobic metabolism is. We know what anaerobic metabolism is. I think we need to spend a lot of time there. Neural control. So this is breathing coming from the respiratory center of the brain, all right, from the medulla, from the pons. All right, so medulla or medullary right? It's going to control your depth and your rhythm. I would know that. Yeah, and then the apneustic center of the pons is the secondary control center if the medulla fails. Then you have your pneumataxic center that has the inhibitory influence on inspiration, meaning that it's going to inhibit inspiration in order for you to blow that air out so that you can have expiration. Then we have your chemoreceptors, right? We've talked about those. They're in the carotid body, right? And the central chemoreceptors are in the respiratory center, in the medulla. We've already talked about what they do. Don't worry too much about this dorsal respiratory group. I would just kind of review it, but we should know already about epoxia, how that works. You should already know what the signs and symptoms of hypoxia are. So VQ, right? Ventilation perfusion ratio mismatch. And so I'll just cover this real quick because we covered this in EMT school as well. So VQ, so V is for ventilation, Q is for blood. That's basically what it is. If you are bleeding out from an injury, the ventilation part is fine. You're still bringing in oxygen. It's still getting to the alveoli. The problem here is Q. The blood's not getting to the alveoli to make that gas exchange, right? And then V is for ventilation. All right, so you're not bleeding out. All right, blood flow is just fine. No problem getting to the alveoli. The problem here would be getting O2 from the environment to the alveoli, right? So this could be anything from being in a confined space, not having oxygen, upper airway obstruction, asthmatic, something like that. All right, let's see here. All right, guys, we're right at 45 minutes, so I'm going to end this one here, and I'll pick up in the next video and talk about factors affecting ventilation. See you at the next one.